The average loudness of a top charting Spotify song right now is minus 8.4 LUFS, but Spotify's normalized target is minus 14 LUFS. That's almost 6 dB of difference. Either every pro mastering engineer is all making the same mistakes, or there's something about loudness for streaming that nobody explained to you. Today, I'm going to fix that. Now, when you go to upload your song for distribution, every single major streaming platform is going to measure the LUFS of that song. LUFS stands for Loudness Unit Full Scale. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that term, it's just basically a measurement of the human perceived loudness of your track. Before LUFS, everybody was using RMS, which is root mean squared. That is an unweighted measurement of your song's loudness based on the power density of your material. It doesn't really represent how loud we as human beings perceive loudness of music. And that's where LUFS came into play. And LUFS was born out of this necessity to control the loudness of commercials in the broadcast industry. So they came up with this ITU-RBS blah, 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 1770 standard for broadcast loudness. This is a way to measure loudness based on a human being and how we perceive it. I'll put a link to this document if you want to go into the details. The important thing I want to share with you is how you measure the LUFS unit. So if we read here, it says the first step is a 2-stage pre-filtering. The first stage accounts for the acoustic effects of the head, which is modeled as a sphere. All that means is they put a high shelf around 2K that is a 4 dB boost. So when they're trying to measure the loudness units of your music, they're going to boost the top end. When they measure the average of all of those frequencies, it's going to actually be held against you a little bit. Without this filter, what people could do is just boost all the high frequencies to make the song feel louder and get around this loudness limitation. So that is why this is taken into consideration when it's calculating the loudness of your song. The other thing that's really important that they do that is good to know is that they actually put on a high pass filter. So they're going to roll off a lot of frequencies, about 100 hertz and below. They give you the exact coefficients if you want to get nerdy about that. These are all sample rate dependent. And this is important so that if you have sub-heavy music, you're not being heavily penalized for loudness because our ears aren't that sensitive to sub-frequencies. So previously, if you had a lot of theatrical elements or 808s in your music, those sub-frequencies make up a lot of the energy density of your music. And if you measure the loudness using something like root mean squared or that RMS measurement method, it would come back a lot louder than what we actually hear it as. So this high-pass filter is actually a way to help balance sub-heavy music without penalizing it for loudness. Because back in the day, it was hard for you to get your bass-heavy music competitive with anything that was focused mostly in the mid-range like pop and rock music. And finally, one more thing I want to mention is that there's actually 3 different time-based measurements for LUFS. If we go back to my DAW, you can see there's momentary LUFS, short-term LUFS, and integrated LUFS. Momentary is on the order of 400 milliseconds, so it's moving window that's measuring the loudness. Short term is 3-second windows moving. And integrated is basically the entire time it's playing, it's adding up the overall loudness and giving you a number at the end. And when Spotify and Apple Music and all these streaming platforms talk about that minus 14 LUFS target, what they're talking about is the integrated loudness of your song start to finish. They're not talking about short-term or momentary. Now, I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be, but there's one other important thing that you need to know about LUFS measurement, and that is that there is actually a gating process after you've done that filtering of your audio, which I show here, which is called a K-weighting filter. There's actually a gating process that says that anything that's below minus 70 LUFS is going to be disregarded in terms of the overall measurement towards the integrated loudness. And what that does is that keeps people from adding silence or really quiet parts, from that making the song on the integrated loudness unit quieter. So it's only going to focus on the louder parts of your song and not consider any of the quieter parts. Now, once it's figured out that number, that integrated LUFS, it's going to set up a second gate, 10 dB or 10 loudness units below that calculated integrated LUFS number. So, for example, if we did Spotify and we did minus 14 LUFS to match their target, there's going to be a gate at minus 24 LUFS. And now anything below that is no longer considered into the integrated loudness measurement for your track. Why that matters is because of this part right here. So you're really only measuring the loudest parts of your song, which means if your track is very dynamic, like more than 10 dB between your chorus and your verse, Spotify or any of these other streaming services is going to only take the measurements of your loudest chorus sections and assign a number to that. That is going to be a lot louder than if it were to average in those quieter sections of your song. So it's going to take that number and lower it down to their loudness target of -14. Now, if you put that back to back with a song that has a verse, for example, that's higher than that secondary gate, those lower loudness units are going to be added into the really loud parts, and it's going to give it a lower overall loudness than your song. And so it'll actually take that quieter song and raise it up. So if you have very dynamic music, there's a pretty good chance it's going to always feel quieter when compared to anything that's a little bit more controlled and a little less dynamic on these streaming platforms. And that is totally not intuitive. And that's why there's so much confusion out there as to why one song sounds really big and loud, another song might not sound big and loud, even though they're the same genre. But if you actually dig into the analytics and look at how the song is in the dynamic range of the songs, there are sweet spots to maximize the loudness and punch of your track. So let's talk about strategies and what you need to do and think about when you're getting ready to release your songs onto these streaming platforms. So something I want to point out right away is Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, all these other streaming platforms, Tidal, they all have different targets. And it's not required for them to make them consistent or the same. And they can change it at any time. So if you take your music and you've intentionally mastered to -14 LUFS, and you don't take into consideration the dynamics or optimizing the loudness and the feel and the impact and the punch of your song, you're setting yourself up for failure. This is why I am a huge advocate on ignoring this -14 LUFS number, and you really just need to make it sound as loud as you can so that it continues to serve the song without being overly compressed. So what's going to happen if you make your song too loud and it's mastered at like -5 LUFS is that these services are going to take your song and just lower the level. Now, what's very important to note is that if your song is too quiet, it's too dynamic, and the integrated LUFS is below their target, some streaming services will just turn it up a little bit. Some services will apply a limiter, which can completely change the feel and the dynamics of your track, which personally, I don't want a robot or an algorithm deciding where to put the limiter on a piece of work that I've created. So by just making the song sound as good as it possibly can, that puts us in a position where we are in control, and the only knob that these streaming platforms can change is the volume. They're not changing the dynamics, none of that. We're in control of that. And on top of all that, all these streaming platforms don't necessarily have that loudness normalization on by default. So again, to keep our music competitive, we want to err on having it sound loud, but still sound good. And I want to show you some statistics to back up what I'm saying. So this is an article by Isotope on the different loudness levels of music on streaming platforms. And these are songs that were some of the biggest songs at the time. If you look at their integrated loudness numbers, they range from all the way from like -6 LUFS integrated to -11. Every single one of those top songs is significantly louder than the streaming target that these platforms are requesting it. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The genre will also change what the typical loudness requirements for that song should be. If we look here, we see that we have K-pop, we have pop music, all very, very dense, very loud. Same with hip-hop. We don't have metal on here, but metal is very, very loud and competitive. I see masters anywhere from -5 LUFS to typically -7 LUFS. But that is because of the nature of the genre. The genre is loud, distorted, crunchy, aggressive. And you can still have a very good sounding song that is at -5 LUFS. I've heard plenty of albums like this. And I know some people are going to also talk about true peak levels and all that. And guess what? There was only a few songs that actually had a true peak below 0 dB true peak. The majority of those top charting songs all had true peaks, and some of them were as loud as 2.3 dB over 0. So that's a really heavily clipped waveform at that point. So if you're curious about true peak or you never heard that before, let me just show you something quickly. If we go back to this document, they explain exactly how to measure true peak values. Here are the guidelines for implementing a true peak level. So all the plugin manufacturers that make true peak meters, they're probably referencing this exact document when they're building out their plugins. So here is the process flow for that. You have a limiter with 4x oversampling. And then after that, you have a low pass filter. So the key takeaways about what a true peak limiter actually is it's just operating at 4x oversampling, and you have a low pass filter. Now, technically, that is sample rate dependent. So if you want a cheap hack for making a true peak limiter, just set it to 4x oversampling. Now, it's not exactly right, but it gets you really close to the ballpark. True peak metering just comes from the concept of trying to understand what the true peak amplitude is when you have a digitized waveform that is very close to digital zero. When your waveform is reconstructed to play through your speakers, it has to go through a digital to analog converter, or DAC. And if you have some samples that are right near digital zero, when it tries to convert that into a sine wave, it actually will go beyond digital zero, and it has a chance to actually clip your digital analog converter. Most modern digital analog converters can handle some intersample peaks to some degree, but if you have a really, really old stereo, there is a chance you could induce clipping with very small intersample peaks. Now, this is not a very accurate figure because clearly this is not plus 1.28 dB full scale, but you understand the concept, hopefully. Now, to prevent these intersample peaks, what Spotify, Apple Music, all these streaming platforms recommend is that we set our output ceiling level to something like -1 dB true peak or -2 dB true peak. If you have heavily clipped, very loud, dense music, they recommend -2 dB. And we actually saw that here with this one song that had a true peak of almost 2.3 dB. Absolutely crazy. And the other reason you want to bake in a little bit extra headroom is because when you upload your high quality, pristine audio file to these streaming platforms, they're going to compress it into streamable formats that are lower quality. Now, when they do that, there's going to be some error associated with that. And that error can lead to creating large intersample peaks, which, as we just learned, can make your speakers crackle if your digital analog converter isn't very good. So what I recommend as a safe middle ground is to just set your output limiter to -1 dB true peak if you want to play it safe. Most of these devices will be able to handle intersample peaks without causing noticeable distortion. So if you want, since there are no hard rules here, you could export your song at -0.2 dB true peak, and it will probably be fine. Probably the best advice I can give you is this. The best streaming level for your music is not the loudest master. It's not the one that's closest to the -14 LUFS target. It's the loudest your song can be while keeping the clarity, the impact, and the emotion of your song intact. As long as you focus on that and you export your song at like -1 dB true peak, your song will sound great anywhere it's played. Don't change what you're trying to do. Don't change the dynamics or the feel of your song to try to appease this moving target that these streaming platforms have. It is merely a suggestion. And as I showed with all the data from the top tracks, some songs sound better when they're louder. Now, if you want to go deeper into mastering, learn how to maximize your song for impact, loudness, balance, and to make sure it sounds great anywhere it's played, I have a complete start to finish home studio mastering course called Conquer the Master Bus. I'll put a link in the description so you can go and check that out. That course is specifically designed for all the challenges that we have in home studios. And I've built a 6-step framework that'll make sure that your music sounds as loud and powerful and impactful as it can possibly be so that when you release it, there's no surprises. Also, if you want to download all those cool figures that I showed here, or you want to download a copy of that 1770 Loudness recommendations document, I have all that in the description. Let me know what you thought. If you have questions or need clarification, drop them in the comments below. Of course, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you get notified when I drop new videos every single week. A thumbs up would be appreciated. My name is Bobby Balo. I'm the mixing mastering engineer at Raytown Productions. I'll see you in the next video.